Russia is in a very odd situation right now. Head of Wagner, Mr. Prigozhin, and his commanders have officially met with President Putin and the Kremlin to discuss what happened with the mutiny and essentially figure out what to do from here. Now, the reason why this is so complex is because Russia is in the middle of defending a counteroffensive in Ukraine. Russia has two top generals who were publicly blasted and made fun of and were called liars on state television. And now Putin is having to decide, do we still work with Wagner? Can we trust Wagner? Or do I have to side with the Russian people and side with my Russian generals and do what's right and not work with Wagner anymore? Well, I got news for you. It looks like Wagner is going to be getting away with all of this because, again, Wagner is supposed to be in Belarus right now because those were the peace agreements, that Wagner would be stationed up in Belarus. Wagner fighters would either leave Wagner, form in with the Russian military of defense, or just disappear forever. But I want to remind everyone exactly what Mr. Prigozhin did before we proceed with speculating on what exactly is going on in Russia. Okay, first things first, we have to remember under Russian law, it's completely illegal and against the Kremlin to undermine the conflict in Ukraine. Whether or not you agree with it in Russia, you keep your mouth shut. If Russia says we conquered a city, you conquered a city. You don't say otherwise. Nonetheless, let's remember that Prigozhin just slammed and called all of the Russians liars who are in charge of this operation. Here's the video to prove it.
Why was the war needed? The war was needed so that a handful of scumbags could have a blast and get PR attention showing how strong the army is. The war was needed not in order to return Russian citizens to our bosom, and not in order to demilitarize and denazify Ukraine. It was needed for one star with additional embroidery, so that one mentally sick man could look good on a coffin pillow. Shoigu lives by the principle that a lie must be horrific for people to believe it.
Okay, real quick, you need some context because you need to understand that Prigozhin is not just going after Shoigu randomly. Shoigu, he's been blasted at the beginning of this conflict by everyone. I mean, when people were starting to dig into his military background and what he was all about, most people understood him, maybe this is going to be like a high-level general and he knows exactly what he's doing for a conflict this complex. But no, he actually has almost no military experience, and many people say he's just a puppet for Putin because he aligns with Putin's mentality to try restoring the Soviet Union. They are both on record of saying they want to restore the Soviet Union. So that's why he's blasting Shoigu. This is not a random attack. Shoigu has been attacked for a long time now.
That's when the lies come.
Prigozhin's referring to Russia's defense minister, Sergei Shoigu, a constant target of his criticism. He's often accused Shoigu and other military leaders of incompetence, but rejecting the core reasons for the war is new for Prigozhin. He says Shoigu's deceiving President Putin and that the war was also used to enrich the ruling elite. Prigozhin also specifically uses the word war in the video, not the phrase special military operation.
So many people got this confused, and I think it's important for you to realize Wagner was not trying to stop this conflict in Ukraine. Many people thought, oh my gosh, Wagner is here to save Ukraine and Wagner are going to team up. That could be further from the truth. Prigozhin wants this conflict to happen. Prigozhin is a fellow fighter of the Russian people. The Russian people actually love Wagner and Prigozhin because of their operations and their achievements within Ukraine. In fact, and as we dig into this video, that is what they talked about during this meeting in Moscow. Okay, so the Kremlin spokesman actually gave a little bit of information as to when the meeting was and a little bit of what the meeting was about. What's interesting is that this meeting was held on June 29th, 5 days after the aborted mutiny. Many people speculated, okay, Prigozhin went straight up to Belarus and everything is over. Wagner's going to fall apart. Operations in Africa. We don't know exactly what's going on. But nonetheless, the meeting was actually held pretty quick after the mutiny, and I don't think many people saw that coming. Some other insight in the highlighted portion, Peskov told reporters that Putin had invited 35 people to the meeting, including Prigozhin and Wagner unit commanders, and that the meeting had lasted 3 hours. So this was a long meeting because, again, Putin probably has the busiest schedule ever. He's always constantly being updated in what's happening in Ukraine and his country. Russia is massive with a lot of its own problems, meetings with China. So to dedicate 3 hours of your time with somebody who is trying to take over Moscow and to try to disrupt the Kremlin, this is a long meeting. Now, to further back evidence that Wagner was never trying to end this conflict in Ukraine and they only wanted to continue this conflict, in this highlighted portion, Peskov, the Kremlin spokesman, said, the commanders outlined their version of what happened on June 24th. They emphasized that they are staunch supporters and soldiers of the head of state and the supreme commander-in-chief, which means they do back Mr. Putin. They also said that they are ready to continue fighting for the motherland, said Peskov. Now, I'm going to say this. I'm going to take this with a grain of salt. Remember, they are getting away with a lot here. They quite literally turned on Russia. They took out Russian Air Force pilots. They took over 2 cities with over 1.1 million people. So what they did was a really big deal. But nonetheless, this is what we are being told. And again, you do need to take this with a grain of salt. Now, something else that's interesting, I might as well throw it in the video, is that Russian's top general, Valery Gerasimov, is seen for the first time since a failed Wagner mutiny. What you need to understand is Prigozhin was not only going after Mr. Shoigu, who's in charge of the Russian military, he was also going after this guy, and many people speculated that Putin may have thrown both of them out of power to please Wagner, since Wagner is such an influential entity within the Russian people and the Russian military. I don't know why these clips are always really awkward, and I feel like Russia is totally just staging this to be like, hey, just so you know, everyone thinks you disappeared, so we're going to start filming you. Just pretend like you're really trying to do your job. Don't be awkward. And nonetheless, these videos are always incredibly awkward. Now, here's what we do know. It's been a little radio silent from Wagner in Ukraine. We don't know whether or not Wagner will still operate in Ukraine. We do know that Wagner does want to still fight for Russia. Now, whether or not they can squash the beef, we don't know. The biggest speculation and what many people thought was going to happen is that Wagner was going to go up into Belarus and try to form some sort of actions or their own counteroffensive to push towards Kyiv, or to make some sort of disturbance in the north to create a flank around Ukraine while they're trying to focus on their counteroffensive to push towards Russia. Something else to consider is that Wagner is not like a bunch of superheroes, and they're not the biggest part of the Russian military, but they are a crucial part of the Russian military. The fact that Mr. Prigozhin and Wagner are able to operate pretty much all over the world, especially in Africa, and still do what they do and be proficient at their job, Putin needs to be very careful of this organization, and he needs to essentially make them his best friend. Now, Wagner never claimed that they were going after Mr. Putin. What they actually claimed was they were just trying to disrupt operations and to show, look, we have power and we don't like who's in charge right now. Again, do not mistake Wagner as a bunch of heroes and good guys. They're not the good guys. In fact, many of them, once this conflict is over, they're probably going to get in a lot of trouble for some of the actions they did within Ukraine and within Africa. Nonetheless, I digress. Russia does need to figure out exactly what they're going to do. If I had to take an educated guess, I do think Wagner is just going to proceed as usual. I do see a future where they're going to go up into Belarus and try to see if they can poke at Ukraine and see maybe they can do some sort of movements up in the north, because Russia was able to almost get to Kyiv. Who's to say that Wagner can't do it without some sort of support or without an actual a competent general? And it looks like Wagner does have a bunch of competent commanders, or at least they're very good or determined to try to get to one objective. As far as actually taking Kyiv, I don't know about that.